Today I have Robert Farries with me. Because I know him for a long time, during this video, I will refer to him as Rob. I choose to speak with Rob because he was, these last 3 months, he was in many situations everyone would consider as normal, me as well. But because our world is not the same and everything in the meantime went upside down, those situations are the one we avoid. We even judge or question. So I wanted to ask Rob, he was in that experience, and I wanted to hear how he went through it. So for the beginning, I would ask Rob to introduce himself.
Okay.
Can you say, please, can you say a few words?
Okay. So Miss Natasha, I've known Natasha for probably 8 years now.
Nine.
I call myself now a data analyst. Initially, when Natasha and I got to know each other, I was just a LiDAR person, but I'm kind of a geographial technician, if you will, just by trade, although I've never had any formal training in it. I have roughly 4 years of university directionless, as happens when one is in one's early 20s. But yes, a data analyst, and I kind of go through life trying to make sense of it all, and I'm not always successful, but I'm a Canadian. I've tried to learn French. I was married to a Filipino for 10 years, so I've learned Filipino. Being a pseudo polyglot is the thing for me, and I'm terrible at it, but I practice all the time, so perhaps I'm better at it than I perceive. The last few months, I mean, we'll go over that later, but I live in Victoria. I've been here 10 years. And this, I feel, is kind of paradise where we live. Very benign weather all year round, and a view similar to what we have behind me. So if you want to know, yeah, I actually look out on a similar view all the time. Anyway, so go ahead, Miss Natasha.
I first want to, you need to prove that you are polyglot, because I know your passion for languages. Can you say something in my language?
Oh, okay. I only really know Dobre dan in Serbian. I know hvala, which is thank you, and I really, to put me on the spot like that in Serbian is terrible. I mean, I know Slavic. I read a book by Anthony Burgess called Clockwork Orange. And if one is willing to read this, it's kind of just a dystopian 60s novel. If one concentrates, one can learn 200 words of Russian in it. The young people in the book speak a version of British English that they call nadsat, which, funny enough, is when you count in Russian and you go to the teenage years, you always say, well, I think it's dva nadsat, tre nadsat, and so nadsat means teen, and in fact it was teen speak that he had in this book. But yes, if you go through the book, and I have very diligently, you can pick up 200 words of Russian. And so wherever the overlap is between Russian, 200 words of Russian and Serbian, that is my overlap.
Okay. Okay, I love that. I love and I appreciate your love for languages. Okay, let's go. We are here because of the coronavirus situation. So I want to ask you for the beginning, when did you hear about Corona?
Okay, well, as well as playing with languages all the time, my recreation is reading an online encyclopedia called Wikipedia. And so my first thing, I'll check my Facebook page, and then I will check Wikipedia every day, and I will go and I check the current events page on Wikipedia, because it gives me what I am hoping is a distinctive worldview. In other words, the news stories that show up in current events on Wikipedia are not local interest. They are global interest. So I first heard of the potential coronavirus epidemic, probably mid-January, to the extent that I would like to consider that I know a ton, or knew a ton about it even back then. And to the extent that I was reading epidemiologist reports and things like that to try and assess what kind of thing we were up against. And it's interesting to contrast my growing understanding, or what I felt was an understanding of coronavirus and the potential pandemic, as to what has actually played out. I have to admit that I have at no point been anywhere near as terrified of it as the media wants me to be, or my government wants me to be, or even my colleagues and the people who live with me on the island. I very much thought and still think that it has been overblown in the media, even despite it being a 1 in 1,000 infection rate on the planet, the entire planet 1 in 1,000. To me, that's a fringe element. It has to, and in the States it is now something almost like a 1% verified infection rate. That is when something may become something that is important for me to consider. Anyways, so yes, my background in corona research, if you will, goes back to January.
Mm-hmm. So probably you were not, as you said, you were not frightened by corona, but maybe you were affected by people's reaction to corona. And can you maybe say something about that? Because,
well, to a greater or lesser extent, I tried to maintain my life despite the so-called pandemic, to the extent that my life actually hardly changed at all. The changes were in the people around me. And now you have to understand, we live in a tourist town here, and the roads are typically chock-a-block. And so one of the first effects mid-March, when the coronavirus response became an issue, the streets cleared out. I had a tourist town that is normally filled with people from all over the planet. I had the place to myself. I could go for walks in the inner harbor downtown. Going to work, it actually became dangerous for me in the last little while because the traffic started up again, because I went for almost 2 months and I rarely had to trek for traffic on one of the busiest thoroughfares in Vic, a road called Douglas Street. And when people started coming off of the pandemic response in the last few weeks, one of the first things that happened is in my daily jaywalk after work, I realized that I was going to have to run across the street or I was going to be struck by a car. And my phone fell out of my pocket and promptly got run over by a couple cars. So my beautiful Xiaomi Chinese top of the line phone got zorched. And so now I'm on a happy 7-Eleven special, and I don't know if it shows up on the screen with the green screen and all, but
and 7-Eleven is a general store, yeah, for the ones who don't know. Yeah.
The one thing though is that I only went 2 hours without a phone, which really someone should think is, despite being in the middle of the pandemic still, I was able to replace my phone and be online in less than 2 hours.
I've read recently that 2.6 billion people were actually staying at home during this last 3 months, which means most of us were working from home. Whereas you, Rob, you continue showing up in the work office, our work office. So I want to know what it's like, because that's a completely normal situation, but with these circumstances, it became something abnormal. And I want to know, can you walk me through your day? Can you walk me through your day? What was like to be alone in the office?
Yeah. My desk probably thought nothing changed at all. I still have my terrible mess. I still have my, but the office environment was terribly lonely. I only, during the whole time, well, I think My main supervisor, Aaron, I think showed up once or twice over the course of what, 3 months, I think it is now.
Yeah, more, even more.
We have our IT guy, Adam Goot, showed up periodically. And my coworker, Scott Hammerton, who is kind of a evening shift guy, showed up about 80% of the time for his regular evening shift. So I had 2 hours of company, typically 4 days a week. But think about that. That's 8 hours of having a coworker, maybe 10 hours out of a 40-hour week. 40. And the rest of the time I had the office to myself. And I went quietly insane. Actually, I didn't go too quiet because at a certain point, I mean, I'm an only child and I live by myself in an apartment, and I have no qualms about talking to myself. It's a habit I picked up, and as long as I don't do it too much in public, or if I do, I laugh at myself and point out that yes, I do talk to myself. That is a sanity preserving thing for me.
I grew up in a family of 3 kids, and I do talk with myself.
I get up with the sun, which in the summer means I'm up at about 5 o'clock in the morning. But I always have a morning run just to get the blood flowing, and so I have a very, what some would think is a pretty strict regime, but it's a way of getting myself focused. I always would go run, shower, get ready, get dressed, get out. I always was eating. I was always eating breakfast at Tim Hortons, and thank God the so-called Canadian institution stayed open all the time, or else I might have starved to death.
Oh. You didn't start cooking?
I always cook myself an evening meal, but the rest of the time I've got other things I want to do. I don't. If I cook, then I will have to do the dishes and things, and I just in the morning I'm not interested.
And did you see a lot of people in Tim Horton?
Oh, not really. I mean, they cut their hours back, and they cut staff back. The one nearest my house, they're only open, I think, maybe 6 till 6. 12 hours. And in fact, people were getting angry because at 6 o'clock they would close, and people would be wanting to have some kind of evening snack or something.
Yes, yes.
But
okay, and after breakfast, you're getting into the office.
Yeah, so I'm always I would open the office usually about 15 minutes to 8. Go and check emails, things like that. Boring. And I'm usually during this Corona thing, it has been spring, right? So once it hits spring, the orientation of our office is such that we get sunlight coming in through the windows, and so it's been blistering hot in the mornings usually, especially if I forget to close the blinds when I leave in the evening. So dealing with the summer heat has been a little bit of an issue. But also, I mean, you get into an office and you know that there's going to be no one there, and you kind of, are you wearing clothes? Is it a big deal? I don't know. Lately, I bought myself a soccer ball because I was just getting so crazy. And then lately at 10 o'clock, I've been going out and I kick a soccer ball against a wall.
So actually, your daily routine, except being alone in the office, didn't change a lot. You stick to your daily routine, like showering and running, and then walking to your office, dealing with the emails, having that small meetings, checkups, whatever, and then just focus on work until lunch break. So in a sense, you didn't notice any huge changes in your productivity, level of productivity. Nothing. Okay.
That may have been through conscious effort, though. I mean, I did not. I was one of those who didn't agree with the draconian measures I thought I saw, and I as a form of protest, I tried to keep my life as regular as possible, insofar as it was possible, and it wasn't to a greater or lesser extent. But to me, became more adamant about my freedoms as the pandemic response increased. So yeah, and I have to tell you, and I know I have before, one of the reasons why you're interviewing me is as the response appeared to be getting more and more draconian to me, I got more and more worried. One has to remember, I grew up in the 70s, and a lot of our literature was things like George Orwell's 1984 and things like this, where we were always, it was kind of a post-McCarthyism fear of communism. And the people control that I perceived in the pandemic response scared the heck out of me.
Many people plan to go for a vacation. It's springtime, it's a summertime, and usually people are booking some breaks. And I was one of them, but I had to cancel in mid-March. Whereas you made completely different decision. You had booked your flight to Calgary.
And in fact, I think I booked my flight when you canceled your trip.
Oh, okay. So yeah, okay. I didn't know that, but I know that you had a really good reason to go.
Yeah.
Your grandson was turning 1 year, and you wanted to be there for the celebration.
Yeah, and as well, I mean, I've got parents. My dad's turning 80 in August, and I have to. I mean, they raised me, and I kind of have to unraise them, right? It's a kind of a rite of passage of middle age, I guess. You have to start taking care of your parents, and it's approaching that time where I'm going to have to make some difficult decisions with respect to where I should live and things like that. I mean, I'm lucky I've got children who live in the same town as my parents, and they may be able to take up some of the slack. But anyways, as well, I mean, one has to, especially in the middle of a pandemic response, when they're saying there's no non-essential travel, I needed to come up with reasons why this travel was essential.
And that was your grandson's birthday.
My grandson's birthday, and taking care of my parents. Family considerations, essentially.
Okay.
But it has to be said that I actually had personal issues. Those being that I was tremendously worried about my civil rights, my right to travel and my right to freedom of movement. Well, travel, freedom of movement, same thing.
Yes.
This turned into a test for me.
Tell me more about that.
So as I booked my flight a month ahead. My grandson's birthday was April 19th. So I typically book a trip to Calgary about a month ahead. And in fact, I booked another trip because my birthday is coming up in a month. So I'm actually going back to Calgary again in a month. Anyways, at this time though, I booked my flight as every day more and more and more restrictions were coming up. You know, I know you and Nikki had the idea where if you had gone on your trip to the Emirates, you were going to be probably subject to a 2-week quarantine there, and then another 2-week quarantine here. And so you had the potential of a month of pseudo incarceration that you wanted to avoid. You know, I can understand that. Mm-hmm. My travel was domestic. Mm-hmm. And the understanding was always that domestic travel was, in theory, had fewer restrictions. Mm-hmm. Having said that, mm-hmm. my family had complete Canadian buy-in with the pandemic response. Mm-hmm. And one by one, my family members started telling me not to come. Mm-hmm. And you know me well enough to know how stubborn I am. So I more and more
refused.
Yeah, I started being one step short of a liar. I started not telling them anything. Mm-hmm. All the while keeping all of my plans in place because I wanted to test. I wanted to find out if I was a prisoner in my own country. Well, I am a prisoner in my own country. I can't actually travel outside the country right now for love or money unless I find some good reason, which I don't have right now.
For example, why I want you to talk about that, the moment I found out that you are actually in Calgary, I was surprised that because my first my thought was, there are no way that you can get from British Columbia to Alberta. There is no way. So everything is canceled. But once you went there, I realized that I'm wrong. The same today. I've heard that international flights are actually going, I don't want to say normally, nothing is as it used to be, but there are still people who are traveling. And I want you to walk me through, because April was the time when there was a lot of stress and fear around. So let's go, walk me to the airport.
Describe the journey, because
yes, please.
Everything online performed more or less the same, other than the requisite COVID warnings. But literally 24 hours before I was supposed to get on my flight, they brought in new regulations to the extent that it was kind of funny, because you could turn it into a Monty Python meme. It was like there was a person who was going to check you before you went on board, and they were essentially going to say, "Those who wish to get by me must answer first these questions 3, ere the other side you see." And this is a line directly from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But it was in fact exactly that way. And I had prior warning of it, to the extent that I knew that if you said yes to any of the questions they asked you, that they would deny you boarding.
Okay, and what were the questions?
Well, I thought they were going to be the same 3 questions all the time. And when I got there, the first question was, have you had a fever? Have you had a persistent cough? And then as the ladies went into the third question, it was involved. And while she was saying it, the guy who was getting us ready to board, I was one of the first people to get questioned, because I was, clearly interested in getting questioned. He was doing regular boarding announcements, and I didn't get to hear this lady's full question. And it was something to the effect, and even after she repeated it, it had what to me sounded like legalese. Like we have to make sure this question is properly formulated, right? It was like, have you had any travel in the last 2 weeks that would preclude you from being able to board this flight? And I'm going, what in the actual? That's a complicated question. I didn't want to answer it without properly hearing it, because if I was, once again, I was getting paranoid. And I didn't want to make an answer that, if it was possible to prove that I lied, I didn't want to be in a position where I could lose my passport or lose my actual ability to travel. Like maybe there's a blacklist. Who knows? Like every day there was new restrictions coming. Did those restrictions include some kind of travel blacklist for people who lie? I didn't know. So I was overreacting the way I thought the pandemic response was overreacting. I was getting really paranoid, and I wanted to make sure that I had an understanding. Well, so I go through, and it's like, no travel. I haven't had any travel. And then I go and I sit on the plane. And as I sit on the plane, Rob, this gentleman you see here, he typically ruminates on things afterwards. He dissects things to an endless degree. I must have too many gears in here spinning or something. Anyways, I was going and I was thinking, I'm coming back home in 5 days. If they ask that same question of me, have I had any travel in the last 2 weeks? I'm going to have to say yes, because I did travel. And I'm thinking, oh shit, I might not be able to come back home. So all of a sudden, there's a new dynamic to my so-called 5-day trip to Calgary. In that, when I come back in 5 days, I'm going to have the questions 3 that I'm going to have to answer. I'm going to have to make damn good and sure that I'm not lying about one of those potential questions. And as it turns out, you don't get the same 3 questions, or didn't get the same 3 questions. They were randomly selected from a list. I didn't find this out until I came back, and they didn't ask me the same 3 questions. I do have a memory. It's short, but I have a memory. They did not ask me the same 3 questions when I came back.
Come on, but they should have asked you about the fever again, and what was the other question? They only
asked one of those 2 questions. They only asked me about the fever, I think. And they had 2 other questions, and one of them was the 2-week travel thing. So
maybe they had you in their system already because you were going through the same airport.
yes.
So you didn't bother to ask the question because they saw it was domestic flight. You went from point A to B, and now you're getting back from B to A. So maybe
it wasn't a health official giving the questions. Initially, I thought it was going to be a health official. It wasn't. It was one of the stewardesses. So they had less of an idea what was going on than maybe even I did. So,
or maybe the regulations are actually changing day by day.
Yeah.
Day by
as
day.
well, I don't think they ever rejected anybody. I never saw anyone get rejected.
Did you see anybody with fever?
No.
What was like on airports?
That's right. Yeah, thank you for reminding me. When I first was on the flight to Vic, we were right in the middle of the pandemic response. I literally had the whole airport to myself. I have pictures of the concourse in the airport, empty.
Empty.
The only person there was me.
So did you had to give your luggage when you were?
When I go to Calgary for short trips, I only have carry-on.
Carry-on. Okay, because I was questioning, like, do you need to do that anyway? If there is
this
like
needs 50%. This needs to be. When I went to India, I typically only had carry-on too. I'm one of these people. I always know that really the world is set up for travelers. At least it was. So I would typically go as light as I could. I hate waiting for luggage on the little spinorama thingies.
Yes,
So,
plus you can lose it every time. You can lose it.
Yeah,
that's also a problem. Okay, so that was experience on Victoria Airport, but what about Vancouver or Calgary? Was it empty?
When I came back, Calgary, once again, almost, well, the main area, the mall area of the airport was pretty dead. To the extent that I could, when I was a little early, but I was able to talk to the lady, one of the ladies who was ultimately going to be asking me the questions, because I was at this point really worried. And in fact, I had actually spent some of my time setting it up to avoid the Bonnie Henry, oh, we had to help someone isolate. I actually had three options. If I got denied flying, I had 3 options for a place to stay for 10 days.
Okay.
Because I wanted to be able to present them with at least one option, so that I wouldn't get thrown into some kind of God knows what situation of isolation, right? I wanted to avoid, I wanted to be planned ahead. Even though everyone was telling me I was paranoid, I needed to be planned ahead. But I went ahead and I talked with the stewardess, and I said, you know, I'm worried about the screening. I need to know that I don't have to lie to get on this plane. And she says, oh, well, you know what? I mean, and they knew that they were going to have to ask the question. She said, well, we do the screening here too. And that was at the desk that you would go and verify your ticket. So they were covering their bases. The stewardesses, the employees, they were covering their bases. And I mean, someone who's sick is typically pretty easy to spot. I mean, they'll be sweaty, they'll be red. I mean, I've got a naturally red complexion, which is not obvious. But you could see that someone would give me an extra look going through.
Yes. Can I just take a time to summarize the biggest fear actually you had was what will happen if they really find you being the one suspected, you know, the one who has fever or is coughing or is sneezing. So you were afraid of you feared what would happen after that with you and with your civil rights. Is that what I'm getting from you, or is it something more or less?
Well, I mean, we have to, you know,
because you took a flight.
With the response that I saw on the island, the obedient Canadian response on the island, empty streets. It was like being in a zombie thriller to me. It was like being on a set of some kind of body snatcher movie or something like this, you know? I mean, empty streets in a town like this scare the scare the HE double hockey sticks out of me, because it's just not normal. And I mean, I overthink things to the nth degree. That's just the kind of person I am. So yeah, and it just built up. And it has to be said that when I got to the area where we were waiting for our plane to come back to to Victoria, most of the people there were behaving absolutely normally. Like, here I am sitting here looking side to side, kind of, where are the health authorities? Oh my gosh, are they going to put me in the straitjacket and carry me away screaming? Most of the other people on the flight on the way back were just completely blasé. I don't think anyone else was giving any thought to the level of paranoia that I was experiencing.
You were in that mode. It's also when you're traveling to some country, when you're traveling to the countries that you don't know much of, and you know mostly from the media what they are saying you about the country and about the people. I can refer to myself. I'm from Serbia, and we had that issue we had major issues during the 90s. But after that, even 10 years after that, when I was traveling, every time people would see my passport, I was freaking out, because I knew that they would take me aside. I will have special questions. They will question my visa. And I was always under so much pressure. It was even self-imposed pressure after a while, because if you start being put aside for years, after that, if people behave differently, you still react the same. So I'm assuming that happened to you, but through media. They put a lot of restrictions, pressure. You saw people around you following that, and then you start fearing that if they continue, what will actually happen with me if I really take that flight, which is like a normal thing to do. And although you're experiencing pretty much normal things, you're still questioning what is coming next. Maybe I don't see it coming. I should be prepared. So you are getting yourself into that mode of panicking and feeling that someone and something can be wrong.
Here I am totally panicking, because I think, oh God, I got to get back to work on Monday, but I've only been here for 5 days. And when they ask me this question, I may have to say yes, and they may deny me boarding. So I went to this with my friend and I said, look, this is the problem I'm up against. And he says, as a journalist would, and a trusted one, and a gentleman who's actually one of the most smart people I know, he said, I'm not aware of any domestic flight restrictions. And I said, well, that's what I thought too, but they're asking me this question. I'm going to have to make sure that I'm not lying when I go, because I don't want to incur some kind of bizarre blacklist because, oh, Robert's a liar. Robert does not want to be a liar. Anyway, so we set it up, and he said, well, I'm not aware of this, but you know what? If you go through and you get denied boarding, and I don't think you will, we will go and do an interview like you and I are doing, but we were going to be on national radio. And I said, you know what? That makes me pretty happy.
You felt safe and secure.
I didn't feel safe and secure at all, because I still had the problem that if I got denied boarding, I was going to have to spend 10 more days in Calgary than I expected, which was going to make me have to buy a laptop so that I could continue working. There's $1,000 expense. I was going to have to provide a place to stay for myself, because I didn't want to get incarcerated. That could potentially another $1,000. I was in a position where I could have incurred several $1,000s worth of unanticipated expense.
Yes, expenses, but you wouldn't be, pushed aside and controlled by others, which is your biggest fear.
Yeah, and I absolutely had no qualms about spending the $2,000, as you say, to maintain my freedom. Not everybody has that option. I am really privileged. Can you imagine if you were, say, an Indian national who happened to be on travel in Canada, and you had your Indian passport and you're only doing domestic travel, but they don't know that. And you were just on a flight 5 days ago, and you say, well, I was on a flight 5 days ago and they say, you're an Indian national, you got to be under quarantine for 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I was terribly worried, but like you say, I backed myself up, and I had my ace in the hole that if my friend was perfectly willing to put me on national radio and we were going to make a stink.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And nothing happened.
And nothing happened except one amazing thing. Everything went according to plan. And when I put my feet on soil on Vancouver Island, I realized, and I've been here 10 years, always felt like I was an Albertan. When I got my feet planted on the island again, I have never felt so glad to be home.
Rob, I wanted to finish, but you actually touch up on those things. I wanted to finish with your thoughts about this global change. How do you see this change will affect? We can stick to your private life. If you started something new, if you decided something new, as you said, you prove to yourself that you're living in a free country, which is enough. But if you can say more about the effect of this change, as in your point of view, the effect of this change on people or society or your own life.
Yeah, my own life, I mean, once again, at my age, I believe, and you've probably seen evidence of it. I mean, I have been in the throes of what one would probably term a midlife crisis. I have one every 10 years, so I don't know if you could call it midlife crisis anymore.
Oh. Maybe you're growing. Maybe you're constantly growing. That's
guaranteed. I've had a number of life-changing things happen to me in the last 6 months. But one of the things that it did, I actually started listening to a co-worker of ours, and I've started writing a novel. Mm-hmm. I'm 20,000 words into it, and I'm just kind of pseudo-autobiographical. I've got a ton of things that churn around in this noggin of mine, noggin head, whatever. And I don't know if I can put it into a coherent enough setup in order for it to be marketable. I don't really care, right? But our co-worker is as a writer, he's probably put 200,000 words to paper, 2 or 3 books and things like this. And so I'm going to try and get him to vet at least a first draft so that he can tell me that I'm not a writer, which is something I probably know already. But or we will work together and we'll make something that is marketable, or one never knows. It doesn't matter. I'm working on something new.
Yes, and it will benefit you. You know, I remember myself putting expressing myself in that way and writing my autobiography. I felt rewarded without even thinking about going publicly or market my book. I just felt rewarded. I saw my life in a different way. I got a different conclusions about things. I noticed the things I should work on. I started that healing process. So I think it will be rewarding, and I'm glad you are doing that.
One of the things I found is that, I mean, there's always the theories behind memory and what one actually remembers, and to what extent what you remember is a function of the recreation of the memory or the actual event. One of the things I find is that going through all of these memories, I go and I start remembering things that happened and details about what happened. I mean, and you always hope that they were backed up by what really happened, but it's not always the case. So, I mean, and I know with me, you know, I have some crazy theories. A lot of the theories that I espouse are creations over time. I have ideas, and then I talk to intelligent people with degrees like yourself, and I get their feedback, and then I put it back in, and I spit another version of the story out to someone else who is educated, and they give me feedback, and I want to spit out a new. I have a collection of what I think are about 10 bizarre stories that could upset ideas that some people consider scientific or whatever. I beat them around in my head, and I feed them to people, and I get the feedback, and I've built them. They're stories. They're like jokes. You know, you have a joke is all about delivery, right? And the correct placement of the punchline. So I've got some ideas that I want to run by people, but sometimes it takes a build-up. You don't always get the person in the right mindset. So, and it's the same thing with writing this autobiography. Is that I mean, there is a story. There's things that happened that were poignant in my life to me. In order to make them poignant to someone else, there's a build-up, right? I mean, we'll go and we'll change it to something that's probably a little more. But you think of a nuclear weapon, great big mushroom cloud and everything like that. There is no accident about that. That was a concerted, concentrated effort of many, many, many people to make a collection of energetic sources such that it could all be released at one single time. It isn't the guy who flicked the switch that made that nuclear weapon happen. It was a collection of materials and know-how and timing devices and other things all coming and coalescing into this moment, and then being released. And we focus on the release, and we don't tend to focus on the buildup. And I think that's where the autobiography is you've got this poignant event, but it was only poignant to you because of the buildup. And there was the release of emotion that happened when it occurred to you. And I think if I make a novel / autobiography, whatever the hell it is I'm building, doesn't really matter. If I make it poignant for someone else, it will be part of the buildup towards that release, right? Guess what I think is one of the basis of my confidence of the way I speak now. I didn't used to speak this way before, you know that. Where do you think I acquired the delivery, the idea that I can make a delivery like this and not have fear? Karaoke.
Oh.
Idea. When karaoke, it's easy, right? They feed you with the lines. But there's also the idea that you know how you want the song to sound. Karaoke for me has always been about, you know what, I'm not a professional singer. I don't do this all the time. Sometimes I need to be fully lubricated in order to do it. And I'm going to get up there and I'm going to make some mistakes. Now, when you make that mistake, and it will happen, when you make that mistake, what do? Do you fall apart and stand there like a bump on a log and think that the disaster's happened, everyone noticed, oh my goodness, I'm a failure? Or do you just keep singing? What karaoke taught me, there's a lot of people who really aren't listening anyway, and you just keep singing, because if you give up, everyone will think you're a failure. But if you keep going, and at the end you go like this, yay, see, people will clap anyways.
Let's clap. Yeah, I love this. I love this. I love this. I can see myself in what you're just, in that picture you just put together. Yo, thank you so much for this. And I wish you a good day today. Thank you for this conversation. And I hope to see you soon.